So I would suggest that one of the first things that we need to look at is the fact that we at local level and the state are indeed partners, that what one of us is doing in terms of taxes affects what the other is doing in terms of taxes. What one of us is doing in terms of economic development affects the economic development of the other. And then use that type of attitude to look at all of what decisions are made at Albany as it affects the local level. As Mr. Ravitch said earlier, when you make a commitment to provide a certain level of services, understand that whether the state is paying for a portion of those services or the county is paying for a portion of those services, it's still coming out of the same pockets from me, the taxpayer. Whether I'm taking it out of my state tax pocket or my local tax pocket, it's still coming out of that same jacket, those same set of pants, that same purse. And so we need to be mindful of the overall costs of these programs and try and be realistic about what we can spend altogether. At the county level, we spend about 89 cents of every dollar that we raise on state-mandated programs. Those rules are established in Albany in terms of, for instance, in the Medicaid program, who's eligible, what services they're eligible for, how much providers will be paid. We cannot control the cost then of 89 cents of every dollar that we're spending. That puts tremendous pressure on the local services, as mentioned earlier, how well we maintain our roads and bridges, whether or not we can put out a sheriff's patrol, whether we can provide senior services, veteran services. And those quality of life services affect whether or not we can attract and keep businesses and families. So we are inextricably linked, and we need to look at the big picture in terms of what can New York State taxpayers afford and what are the services that we can reasonably provide if we're going to not only live within the tax cap, but actually tackle the fact that local taxes in New York State are 80% higher than the national average. And not just cap those taxes, not just grow them at 2% a year, but also lower those taxes so that we can be more competitive, so that we can be more attractive. And as has been mentioned, at the local level, we work very hard at controlling the costs that we can control. And I want to show you just one graphic that I use to get that point across. In the last 6 years, and it's hard to see, I'm sure, but last 6 years, the local spending that we control has gone down 19%. The cost of state-mandated services for us has gone up 58%. I think we need to take the same approach at the state level that we take at the local level. How can we control the costs better? How can we manage to reflect in our spending what it is that our taxpayers can afford at any level of government? I'm chuckling. I think we're either optimists or we're crazy. I'm not quite sure which. But I agree with what you're saying, Mark. It is that cooperation. It is that collaboration across all levels of government with the private sector, with our educational institutions, that is going to make a difference here in New York State, I believe. When we look at some of the changes that have been made that have benefited the local communities, they are, I think, coming from the fact that we've been so boisterous, if you will, at the local level to say these are problems. But I wish there was more dialogue with the state in terms of things that we're doing that I think could be applied very broadly and save not only local governments money, but also save the state money and the federal government as well. I was mentioning earlier that we still do very aggressive fraud work when it comes to all of our social service programs. And Rensselaer County is a relatively small county, 159,000, but we've saved about $1 million a year really manually looking at records between who's in the jail and on our Medicaid rolls, who's collecting money for providing daycare services but then not claiming that money when they're coming into us for services themselves. And I've talked a number of times to different state commissions and testified to these efforts. And I asked the state, please cross-talk your databases. And then you can find this much more quickly than we're finding it for Rensselaer County, but also you can take it across the state. And if we're saving $1 million a year looking for fraud and abuse and misuse of the system in a county with 159,000, imagine what you can do in a population of 18 million statewide. I think if the state took the time to sit down and talk with us at the local level about what we're doing and how it is that we're saving money and look to see how that could be implemented on a broader basis, we would all be the beneficiaries of that. Sometimes it has the opposite effect when the state takes on something in an attempt to economize. I was also mentioning earlier our transportation program for Medicaid. We did it in conjunction with 2 other local counties and our transportation authority. The state decided that they could do it more cheaply, take it on, economies of scale, et cetera, add more counties. We're now paying 25% more for Medicaid transportation than we did. So I think there's a lot to learn from what we experience on the front lines, so to speak, in the trenches, if you will, that could benefit decision making at the state and could benefit both policy and legislation to all of our benefits. And people like the closeness of the village government or the town government or the city government. They like to know who their local official is and to run into them at the supermarket or church or the firehouse breakfast. But if we could consolidate the services in the way that BOCES does so that we're getting the economy of scale, then we should be able to save a lot of the costs that you might if you could talk people into consolidating their government into another level. For instance, snow plowing. If you could put together a plan wherein you would identify all of the areas in your community that should be plowed first in the case of a snowstorm. Well, you got to plow the school parking lots so the kids can get there, and you've got to plow out the police department or the fire department, et cetera. That's something that could be done by one set of trucks going out and doing it, and then continuing on with the rest of the county, but under one leadership, under one entity, so that you're addressing your community as a whole rather than seeing these imaginary boundaries where the village ends and the town begins or the city begins or the school district begins. And we've talked a little bit with our BOCES and with the statewide association about trying to get that type of an operation in place where we could get a better bang for the buck without stepping on that third rail, if you will, of dissolving governments.